The future of spectrum is outlined in a study by the Brookings Institution, and we're going to take a look at pieces of that Brookings study which discusses the future of spectrum. During the past few years, mobile phone subscribers have tripled, and the number of jobs in the field of telecommunications has actually quintupled. There are big opportunities in the broadband wireless area, but there are also problems. The big problem is that limitation of the amount of real estate that we have available for cell phone usage. One of the things we can do is to go to a market-based system of spectrum assignment. One part of the National Broadband Plan is to use a market-based system involving incentive auctions. These incentive auctions allow us to repurpose some of the real estate that has already been allocated to individual industries or individual companies. The FCC is trying to make the spectrum market a bit more transparent. As part of the National Broadband Plan, the U.S. government is going to try to free up 120 megahertz of spectrum. That's a very large amount of spectrum to free up. The spectrum ought to be reallocated to cell phone broadband usage. Every television station in the United States was originally given 6 megahertz of spectrum when the United States went from analog to digital transmission of television. Transmission of digital television has gotten a lot more effective over the last few years, and as a result, to transmit a high-definition signal doesn't take anywhere near 6 megahertz of spectrum. What the government wants to do is to allow television stations to get together, make an arrangement with each other, and agree to use only a single, perhaps 6 megahertz of spectrum for 2 television stations. The additional 6 megahertz that the second station would have used can now be auctioned off through one of the incentive auctions. Television stations might find this alternative attractive because they will actually get part of what is paid for that spectrum. Remember that spectrum used for cell phones is 10 times as valuable as it would be as if you used it for broadcasting television. So many of these television stations may find that one of the revenue streams that they have in the future will actually be selling part of the spectrum that they've been given. When the government gave 6 megahertz to television stations to broadcast digitally, they thought they were actually going to need the entire 6 megahertz. That's one of the problems with government deciding to allocate spectrum. The government never knows how efficient industry can be, how efficient the cell phone industry can be, how efficient the television industry can be in actually broadcasting. It turns out, by using codecs, by using different ways of what we send over the airwaves, we can actually get more into the pipe than we were previously able to do, and that's exactly what television stations have been able to do over time. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, also looks at wireless regulation. Anytime you stop by Starbucks, or anytime you have a pager in the medical industry, you're probably covered by regulations that come under the Federal Trade Commission, not just the Federal Communications Commission. However, regulation of wireless facilities is not just the job of the FCC and the FTC. It's also true that all telecommunications of the United States are covered by some unit of the government. For example, if I have a remote on my keyring and I use it to lock and unlock my car door, that's actually a wireless device. That wireless device is regulated by one of the government agencies. In this case, it happens to be the Federal Communications Commission. The Department of Defense also regulates wireless in the United States. The Department of Defense has to ensure adequate communications for the armed forces in the U.S. Large amounts of spectrum in the U.S. are actually set aside for the use of government agencies, not only like the armed forces, but also for emergency responders. Frequencies used by the armed forces or emergency responders are normally not available either on a shared basis or on a uniquely specific basis for any commercial activities like cell phones and television or radio broadcasting.